Okay, so I think we're going to start with a couple of
Yeah.
talks, and then after that we're going to have like a workshop where we have like different stations and kind of Q&A for that.
Yeah. So thanks everybody for coming today. I'm really excited you're all here. I'm Natalie, this is Robert, and Shane, and Devin. We all come from different professional backgrounds, but we're all vegan activists and members of Animal Rebellion. Can you all hear me okay? So I'll first talk for about 10 minutes on why justice for animals is crucial in addressing the climate crisis, and then how you guys can get involved. And then Robert will then share some of his PhD research, and then the rest will be interactive. Animal Rebellion Oahu is a new chapter of a global movement. We are allies of Extinction Rebellion to end the climate crisis. Last October, Extinction Rebellion took to the streets of London and shut down parts of the city for a few weeks through nonviolent civil disobedience, demanding that the government address the climate emergency. Animal Rebellion further seeks justice for all beings, regardless of species. These are some recent alarming headlines: a cascade of tipping points, ecosystems lost forever, the Amazon burns, sea levels rise, ice caps melt, mass extinction looms. We cannot go about business as usual. The climate crisis is an existential threat. You don't have to be a scientist to feel the ecological grief. I'm far from an expert on these matters, but even when I'm in my favorite place in the world, surrounded by beauty, I feel a deep sadness for what has been lost and what will be lost. Animal crisis. Not only do humans slaughter 70 billion land animals and trillions of sea animals each year, we are driving 1 million species to extinction. We have wiped out 60% of animal populations since 1970. Human actions have globally altered most of the land and the sea. Of all the mammals left on Earth, only 4% are wild. There are almost twice as many livestock animals as there are humans. Animal farming is driving this climate and ecological breakdown. It is unlikely global temperature rise can be kept below 2 degrees Celsius without a shift in global meat and dairy consumption. Per an Oxford University meta-study, animal agriculture is the leading cause of climate change, deforestation, water and air pollution, and habitat and biodiversity loss. It uses 83% of global farmland while contributing only 18% of calories. It also significantly contributes to emissions. Intensive livestock farming, deforestation for cattle grazing, and overfishing leads to an ecological crisis that causes both animal and human suffering. Social collapse, poverty, famine, floods, drought, war, and disease. To end the climate crisis and achieve justice for animals, we must transition to a plant-based food system. According to the Oxford study, a vegan diet is the single best way to reduce our impact on Earth. For example, 1 pound of steak equals the water use of 45 showers. 70% of the land that used to be Amazon rainforest was cleared for animal pastures. It takes about 20 times more land to produce a single serving of beef than plant protein, and eliminating beef can save 2.2 tons of CO2 equivalents per person per year. A plant-based food system would allow a 76% reduction of land use for food. It would reduce greenhouse gases, acidification, pollution, and water scarcity. We could also feed the world's population. Animal rights is a social justice issue. Quote, "Animal agriculture is a hate crime. It is first the performance of violence against animals, but the ecological damage wrought is also an act of genocide against the most vulnerable to the effects of climate change." Christopher Sebastian. Veganism isn't just a diet, but a rejection of violence. Slaughterhouse workers are victims in the system too, and often suffer from PTSD. One worker described his job in which the cows were supposed to be dead before they arrived to a station. They blink, they make noises, he said. The head moves, the eyes are wide and looking around. They die piece by piece. Killing animals is killing the planet and killing ourselves. The leading causes of death in the US are linked to diets high in animal products. The World Health Organization has classified red meat and processed meats as group 2A carcinogens. So I believe animal rights, human rights, civil rights, indigenous rights, and ecological justice are all inextricably linked. Animal liberation is human liberation, is earth liberation. In Hawaii, these are headlines of environmental and ethical issues of dairy and ranching. Local grass-fed beef is often marketed as sustainable, but it would take up to 5 planet Earths to pasture-raise all cattle consumed. By the way, cattle came in Hawaii in 1793. It's a result of Western colonialism. Many indigenous diets, including the native Hawaiian diet, were mostly plant-based. Maori communities in New Zealand are shifting to veganism as a decolonial act to restore their health and their lands. What about backyard farms? These are the hellish conditions of a local backyard farm in which Aloha Animal Sanctuary was able to rescue only a few pigs, and a photo of pigs entering the slaughterhouse in Kapolei. Stats from the Hawaii Department of Agriculture: we consume an excess of protein and not enough plants. Again, the amount of land required for animal proteins is huge compared to that of crops. Animal rebellion is in favor of ethical food sovereignty that does not negatively affect our environment or community health. We're an island in the Pacific, so let's also talk about the ocean. Almost half of all the plastic in the Great Pacific Garbage Patch consists of nets from the fishing industry, and straws are only 0.3 of 1%. We could see virtually empty oceans in our lifetime. Quote, "Here, life is collapsing even faster than on land. The main cause is not plastic, it's not pollution, it's not climate breakdown, it's not even the acidification of our ocean, it is fishing." These are photos from a tour of Honolulu Fishing Village. Their long lines often catch sea turtles and other marine animals. Half of what is caught is not commercially viable and is discarded. Do you see an object for your own consumption, or a sentient being who is violently hooked from their home in the sea? The primary cause of reef fish decline in Hawaii is overfishing. Furthermore, because of ocean pollution, fish are also a leading source of many toxic pollutants in our diets. First, the Amazon rainforest was on fire, and then Australia was on fire. What does meat have to do with it? Vast amounts of water is used to raise meat, used to raise animals for meat and dairy. Only 10% of water is used for the production of fruits and vegetables. Grazing livestock takes over half of Australia's land use. Over 1 billion animals perished in the Australia bushfires, entire species wiped out forever. As a response to the crisis, Australia shoots 10,000 camels for drinking too much water. How eagerly we label other species invasive for simply trying to exist. So now I'll take a little time to talk about animal rebellion. These are our values. We're an anti-speciesist movement fighting for a world that protects all beings for generations to come. We set our mission on what's necessary. There's a critical mass mobilizing 3.5% of the population. We need more people in the streets at climate rallies demanding change. We need regenerative culture. It's very easy to get burnt out as an activist. We recognize the importance of taking care of ourselves and our community. We openly challenge ourselves and our toxic system. We leave our comfort zones, like I am today, and work with allies. We value reflecting and learning from other movements. We welcome everyone and every part of everyone to create more accessible spaces. We actively mitigate for power. Instead of hierarchy, animal rebellion is a holacracy. We avoid blaming and shaming. We focus instead on changing the toxic system. We're a nonviolent network. We learn from the strategies of past leaders, such as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. We are autonomous and decentralized. Anyone who follows these core values can take action in the name of animal rebellion. On Oahu, we're just getting started. We were at the Capitol when the cattlemen were lobbying for more funding. And at Ag Day, we showed slaughter footage next to the beef samples. Among other things, we have been to the climate strikes, and we thank Hawaii Youth Climate Coalition for inviting us to the table today. Veganism is not just a diet, but a way of living. It's a rejection of the exploitation of other beings. We're still developing what the rebellion can be on Oahu, whether it's through nonviolent civil disobedience or creating change within the law. We will fight for a just future. I think you're all here today because you care about our shared planet. If any of this speaks to you, we invite you to join us. I think if you believe in social justice and climate justice, you're already part of animal rebellion. A few of us can only do so much, but I think together we can accomplish the change we so desperately need. You can connect with us on social media or talk to us afterwards. I'll now hand it over to Robert, who's going to talk about his PhD research.
Okay. Has anyone heard, or are you familiar with the concept of overpopulation? Amazing. Overpopulation. Who's heard of that? Okay, good. All right. So overpopulation is actually a central issue that's raised frequently in American public discourse as the climate crisis intensifies and we try to respond. So in this talk, I'm going to explain how I came to study the concept academically and how my understanding of overpopulation and its relation to climate change, or climate catastrophe, I should say, has changed. Before I published a master's thesis on overpopulation and started the PhD work that I'm currently doing, I had just a basic awareness of the idea. Essentially, I was operating under the assumption that overpopulation is a factual, negative situation that we're in, and it's maybe the leading cause of environmental destruction, and we need to do something to try to stop it. Since I didn't know this was even a questionable position, not only was I reflecting this in my general attitude towards birth rates and people having children, but it wouldn't have been something that I would have been able to interrogate through scholarship at that time. So to be able to do that, I had to come to this concept accidentally and unexpectedly, and this is what happened. I was in an American Studies graduate course where we were examining the post-World War II period, meaning about 1945 to 1975. I was looking into the Vietnam War and domestic reactions to it, and I picked up a book about Black feminist anti-war activism. There I found completely to my surprise that in addition to the Vietnam War, African American women were also protesting against coercive sterilization. So coercive sterilization means that women were being operated on against their will so that they couldn't produce children. I found it pretty shocking that this was taking place in such a recent time period, the 1970s, and ultimately I couldn't stop looking into this, and it became my major research project that I'm still pursuing as a doctoral student. So what I started to find is that in the post-World War II period in the United States, there was a major spike in coercive sterilization, and this wasn't just against African American women, but other women of color as well. Some poor white women were sterilized as well, but in surveys, doctors mostly expressed that they were reluctant to sterilize whites. So even when white women were actively seeking sterilization as a liberatory measure in the context of the women's movement, they mostly had to fight for the right to access it. While women of color wanted this freedom too, testimony and evidence shows that far from having to fight for the right to be sterilized, thousands of women of color who didn't want to be were being forced or coerced into it. So during the 1960s and 1970s, birth rates for African American women declined at 100% the rate of white women. Birth rates for Native American women declined at some 700% that rate. And another study from a Native American scholar, Marie Ralston Lewis, finds that from 1968 to 1982, 15% of white American women were sterilized, 24% African American women were sterilized, 35% of Puerto Rican women were sterilized, and 42% of Native American women were sterilized. So for Native American women, estimates for the number of them sterilized actually range from about 25% to more than 50%, and we're talking about all women of childbearing age in the United States who were Native American. And so for some specific Native nations, the sterilization rate went as high as 80%, which is close to total elimination of that group. So this is the environment that the black female activists and others like Women of All Red Nations were protesting against. However, there's more to why coercive sterilization spiked in this particular time period. Before World War II, the idea of eugenics was very popular in Western discourse, especially elite discourse. Eugenics is the idea of trying to improve human groups by either focusing on breeding the right kinds of people or eliminating the, quote, wrong kinds of people from the breeding pool. It was born in the 1800s out of Western imperial nations during a time when they were focused on racial purity, expanding the numbers of white people around the planet, and eliminating masses of people of color like Native Americans who presented obstacles to white domination. Thus, the science of eugenics, or the pseudoscience of eugenics, grew out of a desire to protect, preserve, and expand dominance of the white racial nation. The idea of overpopulation is strongly intertwined with eugenics and expresses the same concerns but actually goes back much further. We can trace overpopulation claims to the beginnings of corporate capitalist ideology in the 1500s and an elite concern with eliminating people who were either extraneous or resistant to the expansion of capitalist control and profiteering. So central beneficiaries of the new capitalist systems saw war and mass violence as methods for eliminating what they strategically called overpopulation. In the early 1900s, prominent figures including President Theodore Roosevelt expressed that war could still be used to deal with the problem of supposed population threats to elite interests and threats to white American nationalism, as you can kind of see in this picture. So this context is crucial for understanding the rise in coercive sterilization that then took place after World War II. This is because at that time, hysteria about overpopulation reached unprecedented heights. Now this is in part because after hundreds of years of white Westerners having comparatively high birth rates and then coming to dominate the globe, now millions of, while at the same time millions of indigenous people were wiped out, people of color during the post-World War II period started to recover and catch up in terms of their birth rates. The American study of population by race, which is called demography, started to receive huge infusions of cash from government and private resources, and the overpopulation concept was also being propagated through specialized scientized literature and circulated in top echelons of U.S. government. It spread to corporate media and was continually touted as an emergency through newspapers, magazines, and TV. By the early 1950s, overpopulation was a household phrase. By 1965, polls of Americans found that they thought it was the second biggest threat that they faced. They considered it an even bigger threat than communism, and second only to the idea of giving foreign aid to poor nations, which people also thought would lead to overpopulation. So basically it was the first and second biggest threat that people thought they were facing. So this was an overwhelmingly white hysteria over losing power relative to people of color, and contributed to the rise in what has been called the eugenic atmosphere that resulted in the rise in coercive sterilization. So sterilization was not only carried out inside the U.S. against people like Native Americans and African Americans, but also around the world through campaigns also funded by the American government, private institutions, and other Western nations. Ultimately, millions of women and some men as well were sterilized, and to a large extent against their will and coercively. So in addition to sterilization, the idea that war and mass violence could be used to fight this so-called population problem had never gone away either. It was still being expressed and strongly felt, albeit in more subtle forms. So what I show in my work is that this fear of rising populations of people of color contributed not only to the spike in coercive sterilization, but to a focus on eliminating masses of people, including civilians, in the simultaneous Korean and Vietnam Wars, largely through the use of area weapons like napalm. In addition to the primary sources from the period, today we have psychology studies, social psychology studies, that illuminate this phenomenon. When white Americans are exposed to just one news article, let alone a constant deluge of hundreds that says the numbers of white people are dwindling compared to the numbers of people of color, you get strong cognitive reactions. Whether liberal or conservative, people become more conservative, more hostile, and more violent towards non-white groups. They turn further against the idea of welfare, which is similar to the fear of giving aid to poor nations, and they turn towards state violence. So these reactions, which study authors note, are far likely they're probably much less harsh and less racist at this time than if the studies were conducted in the 1960s and 70s, stem in large part from a feeling that if whites are no longer the majority, they'll lose power and privilege. One of the main privileges that people that in wealthy nations like the United States fear losing, and how the overpopulation issue really turns out to relate to the climate crisis, is the disproportionate consumption of animal products compared to most of the colonized world. So this fear arises prominently and repeatedly in overpopulation discourse in the post-war period and is still continuing today. Now, the reason that this issue arises is that animal agriculture requires so much land and energy that people worry that with the rise in human numbers, they'll run out of physical space to devote to artificially breeding, feeding, watering, and slaughtering non-human animal bodies by the billions. So at the same time as up to 50% of all Native American women were being coercively sterilized and people were being mass napalmed in Vietnam, overpopulation theorists were arguing that we might try putting sterilizing agents in drinking water sources to further reduce the number of humans, but the idea was rejected not because it was a gross violation of human rights, but because they said it would risk sterilizing farmed animals like cows and chickens, who could then no longer reproduce, and which would cut into American meat consumption. So the incredible inefficiency and environmental degradation of animal agriculture was known and discussed at this time in this period, but the prevailing conclusion of overpopulation theorists was to transfer the blame for environmental degradation away from farmed animal numbers and onto human numbers, and specifically onto people of color. So this way, white Americans could continue and expand their mass consumption of steak and bacon while pointing the finger elsewhere for the harm to the planet. Today, more farmed animals are bred and slaughtered every 2 years than the number of humans who have existed in all of history. This per capita consumption occurs overwhelmingly in the wealthy nations, yet numbers of humans, particularly non-white humans, are still blamed, while the largely white privilege to kill and consume sentient bodies is not only upheld but coveted and fetishized. As activist Christopher Sebastian suggests, the perceived tension between white American farmed animal consumption and the existence of millions of humans of color has become so distinct that meat consumption has essentially become a semiotic marker of white supremacy and entitlement to violence, similar to a political emblem. As the history of the idea of overpopulation suggests, the notion itself arises from violent, oppressive, and racialized impulses, as well as from anthropocentrism and speciesism. Masses of people have long been referred to in terms that are intended to degrade them through association with the non-human animal. And indeed, in addition to psychological studies that track rising white fears and violence towards people of color when their birth rates rise, or even just said to rise in proportion to whites, psychological studies also find that violence towards and consumption of non-human animals is most strongly associated with Americans who are also more violent and more racist towards other humans. So violent, oppressive, and destructive attitudes and behaviors are thus interlinked, whether the objects of abuse are the environment or animals, humans or non-humans. Currently, there are about 7.7 billion people in the world. The human population growth rate has actually been declining since before the manufactured hysteria about overpopulation in the post-war period even reached its peak in the 1970s. The population is expected to top out at about 10 billion, and while a dominant American impulse has been to propagate the idea that we should focus on forcibly restricting or cutting down the numbers of humans, particularly people of color, an idea that has been disastrous for millions of people, the artificially bred farmed animal population has reached some 64 to 70 billion. So on one hand, we have 8 to 10 billion humans, and on the other, we have 64 to 70 billion artificially bred farmed animals. The biggest study ever done of global agriculture was conducted out of Oxford in 2018 and found that not purchasing animal products is probably the single biggest action that we can take individually to reduce our overall impact on the planet. And as other studies have found, it does more than giving up driving or flying completely. And if, among other avenues, we pursue this logic on a vast collective and institutional scale, we can have an incredible impact on reducing and even reversing the damage that has been done. The United Nations points out recently in its report on the climate crisis, there are currently about 800 million, actually more than 800 million malnourished people around the world. This is in large part, the report makes clear, because of the demand for animal products in rich nations like the United States. The report finds that worldwide, farmed animal production, particularly of cows and other hoofed animals, is the single most environmentally damaging way to produce calories. Even the climate-conscious carnivore, the report points out, is one of the least effective diets that people can adopt. The single most environmentally friendly way for people to eat, the report finds, is 100% plant-based, or the term they use is vegan. They say that if the world operated on a plant-based diet, we'd be able to feed more people than we currently do, but using less land. So this is, of course, because farmed animals don't just exist. They have to eat huge amounts of crops, most of the calories and protein from which are then lost by being converted into flesh. For example, growing a cow ultimately requires some 15 times the cow's weight in plant foods, which highlights why animal flesh has long been seen as a luxury item and is mostly consumed by the world's wealthy. It also helps us understand why the Oxford study finds that a plant-based global food system would still feed the entire world, but it would reduce the amount of land that we're currently using for agriculture by a full 75%. So this means we'd be freeing up an amount of land equivalent to the size of the United States, China, the European Union, and Australia combined. We could then convert much of this vast amount of land to initiatives like reforestation, which can absorb carbon on top of the emissions reductions we already gain by eliminating animal agriculture. So the world's biggest nutrition organizations comprise hundreds of thousands of nutritionists, and they conclude that humans have no physical need to eat animal products at any stage of the human life cycle. And indeed, refraining from doing so can ironically eliminate the leading causes of death in the rich countries. The United Nations, though, highlighted what's obvious, which is that diet is largely not about evidence. As we've briefly seen in this talk, diet can also be a conduit for deeply ingrained emotions and complex, historically rooted phenomena like white entitlement to supremacy and domination. But I've come to see that with awareness, we can collectively and intentionally extricate ourselves from these kind of regressive and destructive paradigms. I, for one, was a manifestation of these kinds of ideas and attitudes for decades, but with some effort, I changed and started putting my energy into more productive endeavors. And I think if I can do it, a lot of other people can too, and we actually need as many people as we can get. So, if you have any questions about specific sources or anything that I mentioned in that, you can send me an email right there, or you can ask me right now. Thank you.
Does anybody have any questions? Yeah.
I don't know if I'm going to phrase this correctly, but so it sounds like maybe what you were writing about was about how the influence of colonization has yielded to some sort of result of farming, kind of, directly and indirectly. And it almost kind of sounded like you were talking about how the term overpopulation might have been like a term, like brainwashing, if you will. I don't know if that's kind of what you're getting.
That might be the effect. I think I was saying the idea of overpopulation arises from early capitalist systems where you have a small minority of people who want to control a big amount of people. And so if there's people in that larger mass that they feel are extraneous to the system or that they need to be subdued, they started calling them terms like overpopulation. So that would justify kind of getting rid of them in some cases, like through mass violence.
It's kind of just an observation, but I found it interesting that a lot of this happened post-World War II when 2% of the world's population roughly was killed.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right
So
away, people are saying overpopulation, it's not that thing, following the Holocaust and all these different things.
yeah, so actually it's really an important point. I think a lot of people, more people should know about this too. There's at least one good book written on how obsessed the Nazis were with the idea of overpopulation, and they were using that same idea that derives from the same history to justify a lot of what they were doing. So there's a book called Architects of Annihilation by Goetz and Heim. That's about exactly that. And so and another thing that it's highlighting is it's not really like a logical, like genuine thing that people really think is going to solve the world's problems. That's why I was mentioning these psychology studies that find these are cognitive, emotional reactions that people have, and they're very strong. So it's an emotional thing that affects people's behaviors and policy. It's not necessarily logical. It kind of, you can make some arguments in some cases that it could be.
Yeah.
I actually have a few questions.
Yeah. Please.
So, the animal rebellion sounds like a good idea, but I want to know what concrete steps you guys have planned for the future that might get you to where you want to be.
It's a great question. So we launched, just recently. So there are a couple of vegan activist groups in the community, and a lot of them are focused on like individual outreach. I think the strength of Animal Rebellion is really targeting system change through civil disobedience. We haven't gone there yet, but we're working in alignment with Animal Rights Hawaii to work on things on the legislature side. We're looking at maybe doing a pressure campaign. Does anybody else want to chime in?
Yeah, so Animal Rebellion started last summer in London, and by occupying Trafalgar Square, and I was there. I was part of that. We did the Climate at the Capitol event. So we're just constantly brainstorming and coming up with new ideas. But if you join, it's like not an official thing. If you want, you can tell us your ideas right now, and we'll maybe we'll do them.
Well, I think
We're
there'll be a
basically
time
yeah.
for that, right? So
Sure.
then, I wanted to know your opinion on urbanization, how that could affect things like our space usage and our waste. Do you support it, or?
I couldn't hear the whole question. Sorry.
Okay, sorry. I'll speak louder. So, do you support urbanization, or are you against it?
I don't know. I'm not it's not something that I study a lot. I don't know.
I think there's a lot of issues with development on this island.
Yeah, she's an architect.
I'm an
so-
architect, and I struggle with this every day. And we have to address the housing crisis and providing affordable housing for people, while at the same time protecting what's so beautiful about Hawaii, which is the land. So I don't know what the right answer is. I think there's efforts to do things responsibly by trying to concentrate the development in certain areas that are already urbanized, and by building up instead of sprawling out. I don't know if that answers your question. I definitely feel the struggle. You see those aerial maps over the decades of just the concrete eating into the green, and that's devastating to see.
But yeah, so I mean, I'd have to look into it more to give a good answer to that. But the main thing that we're focusing on with this is the food system.
Oh, well, I have a follow-up question.
Sure,
Yeah.
sure, please.
Okay. So we all know that urbanization can concentrate our infrastructure in one area, and I was wondering if maybe, particularly for meat-based diets, you said it takes up a lot of space. So do you think that if we urbanize more quickly, we could probably, I mean, I'm not saying meat-based diets are good, but do you think we could allocate more space to farming and stuff?
Well, that's what factory farming is, right? So that's trying to that's what's already being done. It's like trying to concentrate it into as efficient amount of space as possible. So that's the idea of factory farming. So that kind of arose in the 1890s in Chicago when marketers started trying to sell more meat, and so they started doing these kind of like industrial plants. And there's some good books about how that started. Like Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle, is a good look at those early factory farms. Yeah, so that's what that is. But it's still you still need to grow. Like just a cow is just one example. It takes if you have 1 pound of cow body, it takes 16 pounds of plant foods. So you have to have all that land. Yeah. And of course there's water, and then there's the energy of refrigeration. So actually on average, it takes about 1,136% more energy to produce animal-based foods than plant foods. Did you have a question?
I was just saying that you have to take into account the amount of land used to grow the food to feed the animals.
Oh yeah, I know what you're saying.
Yeah, and that's it's actually another social justice issue as well, because this is part of the reason why people get scared about overpopulation, because they feel like we have to use all this land if we want to keep eating this much meat, and so they feel like we have to start cutting down on human numbers basically to be able to do that. Yes, sir.
So I just noticed that when you're working with issues that are kind of polarizing like this, and you discussed like how culturally ingrained some of these groups are with their consumption of meat.
Yeah, and I'm like, that's like the culture that I come from.
Yeah. Well, it's just what are your plans for? Because I just see a lot of organizations that are really good at recruiting people that tend to already kind of agree with them.
Okay.
And something like this is like something that obviously we're going to have to convert people who really don't believe in this. So like, how do you see that unfolding?
I think so. We're vegan activists in a couple organizations. We've tried different tactics. And I think the strength of Animal Rebellion is not shaming individuals, saying like, it's your fault because you ate a hamburger. It's recognizing that it's the system that's messed up. So like, you don't even have to be vegan to join us. Like, if you believe in a vision where there's a more just, ethical food system, like, please join us. Yes.
This is a bit of a loaded question, but so like considering that we've talked about the animal industry, like a lot of the workers that are in there like have PSU, but they're also like immigrants and people who just need jobs.
Absolutely.
So then understanding that it's a systemic problem, how would we also like help the people who need jobs still? Because it's not like they're just creating jobs that fast.
Yeah, of course, that's a big issue. Something we definitely support is taking care of people who, whose jobs might be in flux in like kinds of transitions. This was also not to try to create a direct like analogy here, but this was one of the issues with the system of enslavement in the Americas. So many like careers and jobs and things were tied up in it, but there was a bigger issue that had to be addressed, and so we couldn't worry about that. That couldn't be the dominating concern. There's a bigger issue there that has to be addressed. But yes, people absolutely have to be taken care of. I also used to work in an industry that has kind of gone out of business, because I used to work for a company that made DVDs. And so now everything is digital and on Netflix. So so you have to adapt. Yeah, the world has to adapt when things change like that. And sometimes they just change for reasons of like technology progresses and it's just entertainment. But this is a change that kind of has to happen for planetary health and sort of survival. Yes.
Just an additional, not that this is a little far in the future, but there are groups that are trying to help animal farms transition to growing crops, I suppose. So we're trying to create systems so that people aren't left with, nothing to dust.
Yeah, we're not even shaming the animal farmers. It's like, there's an effort to get them to transition to more sustainable and ethical, plant farming.
Yeah, that reforestation would probably create an industry too.
That's right. Yeah. So people in the kind of mainstream political discourse at the moment who are promoting these kinds of things do talk about that. Like you can create a lot of green, they're called like green jobs and so forth. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Sorry, I know I've been asking a lot of
Okay.
questions.
No, it's fine.
But all right, so I feel like we're gonna get on this topic anyway. So, do you believe that GMOs and synthetic meats might be the answer to the problem?
So yeah. What's the kind of meat called? Like lab-grown meat.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's less energy intensive. So yeah, that can be part of the solution, sure. And the United Nations has been giving awards to people who started companies like Beyond Meat. Have people heard of that? Yeah. So he won. The person who started that won, like some major recognition for helping to, move more towards just an entirely plant-based agriculture system that's so much more efficient. Yeah. So those things could be helpful. But in terms of GMOs, that's a good question. So most of the pesticides and that are used right now are put on crops that are then fed to animals who we eat. So one person, George Monbiot, who's like a journalist who studies this a lot, has said if you want to eat less GMO soy, you would eat GMO soy because there's less soy in a serving of soy than there is in a serving of meat because the animal had to eat more meat than is left afterwards to have that piece of body. I mean, more plants.
Yeah, and 70% of the plant crops are used to feed animals to be meat.
And I've seen studies about that some types of pesticides I think are dangerous and damaging to humans as well, like glyphosate. The Monsanto one, glyphosate, is bad for people. But there's some other forms of GMOs, like genetically modified organisms. Not talking about pesticides that I think studies show actually haven't shown any negative effects. But I personally, I wouldn't try to eat that on purpose.
That's one more question.
Yeah, of course.
So I'm from the Midwest, and I just noticed I've done a lot of field work out there. And when you drive around the Midwest, you just see endless corn and soybean. And pretty much.
Nebraska, I know what you're
Nebraska.
talking
Yeah, you know what I'm
about.
talking about, right?
Yeah.
And you realize that almost none of that is actually grown to be eaten by humans. So do you think that this could sort of be a secondary way to kind of push the eat locally, farm locally movement? Because if you have all that land that's no longer growing corn for beef, you could use it to actually grow vegetables to eat in Wisconsin instead of somewhere else.
Yeah, which would be more efficient than shipping it in from somewhere. Yeah, absolutely.
Less carbon intensive and all that too.
Yeah, it's a great idea.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
Sorry.
So I know with being a vegan, you are an activist on all lives, but how would you feel if, give 20, 30, 40 years down the road, we find out that like eating insects and bugs is more beneficial? Is that something that you, like, how do you feel about that?
If it turned out that like you had to for your health,
Not, well, I don't know if you had to, but I guess it's another alternative than meat.
well, what we usually say is like our philosophy kind of is we just try to hurt other sentient life as to the smallest extent that we can. So if you had to for survival, I think that would make sense. That would be a good reason to do something. But if you just had a choice and there was something less impactful and less kind of violent towards other sentient beings, I try to eat as low on the sentience chain as I can. I think that's the general idea.
Did you have a question?
Coming from a culinary background,
Of which culinary?
yeah.
Yeah.
How would you guys help chefs transfer from a lot of these meat-based menus into vegan diets? Like I know, like what you guys said, that you're not trying to force anyone into it, but in order to help the industry become more better by helping a lot of this.
I think she wants to help answer. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I actually worked in a vegan restaurant for a little, well, sort of. But a lot of it is also just creating the options. What they're finding is if you make, like, for example, if you make a menu, like right now these days, it's all meat and then maybe like one or two vegan options. If you reverse that and maybe make it mostly plants, but then having one or two meat options, people are all like, they order the vegetarian
It's a good question though too, because if you start to look into it, like just doing some Googling, whatever, you'll start to find like just countless thousands of cookbooks and like websites, so many resources and things devoted to it, because people have been doing it for a really long time, and so there's great resources on it. Yeah.
One more question. You guys know how there, I don't know if you guys know who Chef Roy Yamaguchi is, Roy's eating on 1749. On his website, he's actually working towards a sustainable stuff for his restaurants. Do you guys agree with that, or because you guys know what I'm talking about?
I'm not directly familiar with it, unfortunately.
Sustainable as in locally grown products, and a lot of that stuff coming from meat-based foods. Do you guys necessarily agree with that?
We don't. Like when we went to the event with the cattlemen at the Capitol, you know, they were saying that their ranching was actually good for the environment, and I think they're perpetuating a lot of myths. You know, just it's marketing. I think if we really want to be as sustainable as possible, we eat as low on the food chain as possible.
There's just quickly,
I'm
there's.
really sorry. No, there was actually, the truth is, to a certain degree, saying eating locally is kind of a buzzword actually to a certain degree with what you're eating, because they found actually that a diet that is mostly plants but you have a lot shipped in is actually still lower on the greenhouse, produces less emissions than if you have a diet that's local but has a lot of meat in it.
Thanks, Nikki.
So yeah, so it would be more sustainable, like environmentally speaking, to do like local meat, but we showed a picture of a local pig farm that we've been to, and it was, don't want to, but it was not good. And so it would be more sustainable than shipping it from the mainland or wherever else, but it's also less sustainable than doing other plant-based options. So you can still get more sustainable than that. And then two, we're also coming from a philosophical position at this as well, which says if we have a choice, we don't need to kill someone for survival. We're not going to do that because we don't want to take away their life just for culinary entertainment.
Yeah.
What are some ways that us, the newer generation, could do to start helping our community and environment?
Anybody else?
So I'll jump on this real quick. So I think spreading awareness is absolutely key, and all the issues that we brought up here, I want to thank all of you guys so much, because it is really a multifaceted issue that we're dealing when we're talking about these types of issues. It's not just there's a one and done solution. There's going to have multi-tiered effects. So we have to look at the immediate effects of what it does when we change our individual choices from one area to another area, how that's going to affect things. So that's already going to make a huge effect on an individual level, because each person is their individual sphere of influence. The more people you talk to, the more people are going to start considering different perspectives that might divert a little bit from what their own individual perspective is. So I would say that's the most immediate, most resource, non-intensive process that you can utilize on an individual level to affect that change. And then once we start going into the bigger change, that's when we start looking at community outreach. We can talk about individual outreach. We can talk about legislative outreach. Writing these new bills that are going to affect the laws that are contributing to animal agriculture industry being able to conduct these activities that are oppressive in nature to human beings in general, but also obviously to the animals, when it comes to that situation. So does that, I know that's a very broad answer, but we're kind of short on time, but I can definitely go with you after this if you're interested in more detailed answers.
And one other thing I would add is we're trying to just, if more people can join, we're trying to actually start like a lobbying group of our own, to like a concerned citizens group, to push for moving towards a more sustainable food system here specifically.
Sorry guys, but we're actually out of time now.
Okay, well thanks everybody.
Thanks everyone for coming.
Yeah, thanks for listening.
Thank you guys so much.
Sorry we deviated from our plan.